Hello everyone. So we'll be continuing from where we left off. We had discussed the perceptron model and now also the analogy to the NAND gate. So now we'll be focusing on the sigmoid neurons. So let's get started. Learning algorithms sounds terrific, but how can we devise such algorithms for neural network? Suppose we have a network of perceptrons that we'd like to use to learn to solve some problem. For example, the inputs to the network might be the raw pixel data for a scanned, handwritten image of a digit, and we'd like the network to learn weights and biases so that the output from the network correctly classifies the digit. To see how learning might work, suppose we make a small change in the weight or bias in the network. Okay, what we'd like is for this small change in weight to cause only a small corresponding change in the output from the network. Yeah, so when we're tweaking the weights, this essentially means to say for instance, you're tweaking the weights to reach that perfect set of weights, which we've been discussing what machine learning actually means. So you don't really want to tweak the weight by say a factor of 0.001 and your output changes by a factor of 10 million, right? That would make it incredibly difficult to get like a concrete result. Say you're very close to the result, say you want the output to be 6, the machine is outputting 5. You want to tweak the input slightly, but if by tweaking by a small factor changes the input output from 5 to 25, then that would make it really difficult for the machine to learn. So as we'll see in a moment, the property will make learning possible. Schematically, here's what we want to do. Obviously, this network is too simple to do handwriting recognition. So small change in any weight or bias causes a small change in output. So they've changed the weight by delta W, so they're expecting the output to change by delta output. Okay. So if it were true that a small change causes a small change in output, then we could use this fact to modify the weight and bias to get our network to behave more in the manner we want. For example, suppose the network was mistakenly classifying an image as an 8 when it should be a 9. We could figure out how to make a small change in the weight so that the bias of the network get a little closer to classify the image as a 9. And then we repeat this, changing the weights and biases over and over to produce better and better output. The network would be learning. Yeah. The problem is that this isn't what happens when a network contains perceptrons. In fact, a small change in the weight of bias of any single perceptron in the network may sometimes cause the output to completely flip, say from a 0 to a 1. That flip may then cause the change in behavior of the rest of the network to completely change in some complicated way. So while your 9 might now be classified correctly, the behavior of the network on the other images is likely to be completely changed in some hard to control way. So it might be that the 8 is now recognized as a 9, but the 7 is now a 5, the 2 is now a 8, and so on. That makes it difficult to see how to gradually modify the weights and biases so that the network gets closer to the desired behavior. Perhaps there's some clever way of getting around this problem, but it's not immediately obvious how can we get a network of perceptrons to learn. We can overcome this problem by introducing a new type of artificial neuron called a sigmoid neuron. Sigmoid neurons are similar to perceptrons but modified so that the small changes in their weights and biases cause only a small change in their output. That's the crucial fact that will allow a network of sigmoid neurons to learn. Okay, let me describe the sigmoid neuron. We'll depict sigmoid neurons in the same way we depicted perceptrons. Okay, so just like a perceptron, the sigmoid neuron has x1, x2, and so on. But instead of being just 0 or 1, these inputs can also take any value between 0 or 1. So for instance, 0.638 is a valid input for the sigmoid neuron. Also, just like a perceptron, the sigmoid neuron has weights for each input, W1, W2, and so on, and an overall bias B. But the output is not 0 or 1. It's instead sigma of w dot x plus b, where sigma is called a sigmoid function and it is defined by sigmoid of z is equal to 1 upon 1 plus e to the negative z. So this is quite a lot to take in, but let me just tell you what really changed. In perceptrons, x1, x2, x3 was 0 or 1, right? So the first fundamental change is now your inputs can be some other in between values like 0.638, 0.712, 0.692, and so on. Next, these go into this. They all have the similar concept of weights and biases. So you have a W1 x1 plus a W2 x2 plus a W3 x3, and you add a bias. But it doesn't end there. The summation can be represented as a dot product as we had studied earlier, but after this entire process, we apply the sigmoid function to it. Now, why do we do that? We'll get to it, but this is essentially what happens. So suppose this was a value, say 7, then you do sigmoid of 7. So sigmoid of 7 would be 1 upon 1 plus e to the negative 7. Okay, so there's now a very interesting fact. Incidentally, sigma is also sometimes called the logistic function, and this new class of neurons called logistic neurons. It is useful to remember this terminology since these terms are used by many people working with neural nets. However, we'll stick with the sigmoid terminology. Yeah, so we'll be following the sigmoid terminology. As I had shown earlier, you have e, which is essentially Euler's number. So when there's something raised to the e, people often represent that as exp or exponential. So you have exponential of this value, which is nothing but the negative of z. Z was wx plus b, w dot x, and w dot x was this very summation. So if you put everything in here, you see that this is nothing but this very term with this substituted in. So at very first sight, sigmoid neurons appear very different to perceptrons. The algebraic form of the sigmoid may seem opaque and forbidding if you're not already familiar with it. In fact, there are many similarities between perceptrons and sigmoid neurons, and the algebraic form of the sigmoid neuron turns out to be more of a technical detail than a true barrier to understanding. Yup. You see that this is one of the most easiest things to grasp. To understand the similarity to the perceptron model, suppose z is equal to w dot x plus b is a large positive number. So when this is a large positive number, you have say e to the negative 1000. So that would be 1 upon e to the negative e to the 1000, right? Because negative powers just take the reciprocal. So you have 1 upon e to the 1000, and when you have 1 divided by such a large number, the value would tend to 0. So when a very large number is inserted, e to the negative z approximates to 0. And then sigmoid of z is 1 upon 1 plus e to the negative z, where e to the negative z is tending to 0. So essentially sigmoid of a very large number is 1. So in other words, when z is very large, where z is wx plus b, the output from the sigmoid is approximately 1, just as it would have been for a perceptron. If you remember, when you get a had those threshold concept, right? So you had defined those barriers, and then you remove the threshold to add the bias, but still when the value this value z is large and positive, you can sort of guess that it would behave like in the case of perceptron it would have given a 1. So suppose on the other hand this is very negative, like very negative. So e to the negative z tends to infinity. Let's again evaluate how. Say z is negative 10,000. So a negative times a negative is a positive. So you get e to the positive 10,000 essentially. And e raised to the very large number essentially grows exponentially and tends to infinity. So now if this value is tending to infinity, if you are familiar with the concept of limits, you have 1 upon 1 plus infinity, right? And not exactly infinity, a value tending to infinity. So very large value. So you have 1 upon 1 plus, say, 100 million. So 1 upon 100 million essentially is 0, right? It tends to 0. It is a very small number. So for all practical purposes, it would be 0, tend to approximate to 0. So when this value is very negative, the behavior of the sigmoid function also closely approximates a perceptron, because when the perceptron also had a very negative value, it gave a 0, or it remained inactive, it did not fire. It's only when this is of modest size that there is much deviation from the perceptron model. So let's have a look at the plot to get a more visual intuition of why this is happening. So uh, the exact form of sigma isn't so important. What really matters is the shape of the function when plotted. Okay, so I again and again make this blunder of calling this sigma instead of sigmoid. This symbol is sigma, but I should be really calling it the sigmoid. So you can see when as your z is increasing, and it will increase to say very large values, the value is tending to 1. It will not touch 1 unless you have like perfect infinity or something. And similarly with very negative values. And this shape is a smoothed out version of a step function. So earlier when you were evaluating the perceptron, what you were essentially doing was using a step function. If the output was greater than 0, output of 1. If it was less than 0, then output is 0, right? If sigma had in fact been a step function, then the sigmoid would be a perceptron, since the output would be 1 or 0 depending on whether wx plus b is positive or negative, right? If wx plus b was positive, you get a 1. If it was negative, you get a 0, just as the step function. By using the actual sigmoid function, we get, as implied above, a smoothened out perceptron. So essentially, instead of this jagged, non-differentiable, non-continuous portion, you get a smoothened out curve which gradually increases, right? Indeed, its smoothness of the sigmoid function, that is the crucial fact, not its detailed form. The smoothness of the sigmoid means that a small change delta Wg in the weights and delta Wb in the bias will produce a small change in output in the neuron. In fact, calculus tells us that this output is essentially okay. So this might seem a bit intimidating, but bear with me, it is not at all. If you have like basic experience with calculus, this is very intuitive. Okay, so let's just read what they have explained and then go with my explanation. Where the sum is over all the weights wj and del of output over del of with respect to weight j and del of output with respect to del of b denote partial derivative of the output with respect to wj and b. Don't panic if you're not comfortable with partial derivatives. While the above expression looks complicated with all the partial derivatives and stuff, it's actually saying something very simple and which is very good news. So the change in output of is a linear function of the changes in the weights and the changes in the bias, right? This linearity makes it easy to choose small values in the weights and bias to achieve any desired result. So while the sigmoid neurons have much of the same qualitative behavior as perceptrons, they make it much easier to figure out how changing the weights and biases will change the output. Okay, so to really grasp what this was, let's go back to the function which we had. Our function was w of w dot x plus b, right? So if you have a look at this, w dot x was essentially the summation. So they've just taken the derivative with respect to the summation first. So with respect to the weights. So with respect to the weights, you get you use the partial derivatives and you get this term. While when they take the derivative with respect to the biases, again they use the partial derivatives and you get this term. So this term essentially is just reflecting the partial derivative of the first term, which was the dot product, and this is the partial derivative of the second term, which was the bias. Okay, and yep. So moving ahead, if it's the shape of the sigmoid which really matters and not its exact form, then why use a particular form used for sigmoid in equation 3? In fact, later in the book, we will occasionally consider neurons where the output is f of wx plus b, where for some other activation function. So sigmoid is also an activation function. There are a ton of activation functions. There is the hyperbolic tangent, there's the ReLU, the leaky ReLU, and many more. The main thing that changes when we use a different activation function is that the particular values for the partial derivative change. Obviously, they would change because now when you take the partial derivative, you have another function to consider. It turns out when we compute those partial derivatives later using sigmoid, we'll simplify the algebra simply because exponentials have lovely properties when differentiated. So if you've taken any calculus class, you might know that the derivative of e to the x or the exponential is itself. Isn't it surprising? Even the integral of e to the x is itself. Obviously, you get a constant, but I'm just talking about the main crux function. In any case, sigmoid is commonly used in work on neural nets and is the activation function we'll use most often. So how should we interpret the output from a sigmoid neuron? Obviously, one big difference between perceptrons and sigmoid neurons is that sigmoid neurons don't just output 0 or 1. They can have as output any real number between 0 and 1. So 17.173.689 are all legitimate outputs. This can be useful, for example, if we want the output to represent the average intensity of pixels in an image to a neural network. But sometimes it can be a nuisance. So why does it make sense in this image case? Well, if you're familiar with the RGB concept, you might know that the scaling is done from 0 to 255, right? or if you scale it down between 0 and 1, it wouldn't really make sense if you're predicting images or generating images or something of that sort to only give an output to 0 or a 1, right? It will be make much more sense if you say give an output of zero point 0.6 or an output of zero point 0.7 to give an intensity to that pixel rather than a pure white or a pure black or something of that sort. Uh, Suppose we want the output from the network to indicate either the input image is a 9 or it is not a 9. Obviously, in this case, the output was 0 or 1 as in perceptron. But in practice, we can set up a convention. So, like we can say, we can define if the model after the sigmoid is applied and all the stuff is done. If you say you see a value greater than zero point 0.5, give a 1, or less than zero point 0.5, then give a 0. So a 1 in this case would indicate a 9, and a less than 1 in this case would indicate not a 9. So I'll always explicitly state when we're using such a convention. Okay, so let's have a look at the exercises. uh, okay, sigmoid neurons simulating perceptrons part 1. Suppose we take all the weights and biases in a network of perceptron and multiply them by a positive constant c so that the behavior of the network does not change. Okay, right. So how can we show this? Let's think a bit about it. If you go here, this was the equation which we were using, w dot x plus b, right? So if you scale all the weights and all the biases, so the weights would now be say some alpha time w, sorry, c time w. So the expression would be cwx plus cb, right? And then you apply the sigmoid. So essentially, we haven't really uh, changed anything, I believe. Obviously, you've multiplied it with some constant, but you've multiplied it with the entire thing. So you can just, it is just equivalent to taking out that constant and having the original form. And you can always think of it in this way as well. Those weights were also scalars, right? So I believe the rationale here would be you can think as them being a new set of weights, or them being new biases, which will function in the very similar fashion to in what they were doing earlier. But I think this is, I'll have to look this up a bit as well. So do a bit of research. Sigmoid neuron stimulating perceptrons part 2. Suppose we have the same setup as the last problem in network of perceptrons. Suppose also the overall input to the network of perceptrons has been chosen. Okay, we won't need the actual input value, we just need the input to have been fixed. Suppose the weights and biases are such that this is not zero, okay, for input x to any particular perceptron. Now replace all the perceptrons by a sigmoid and multiply the weights and biases by a positive constant so that in the limit C tends to infinity, the behavior of this network of sigmoid neurons is exactly as the network of perceptron. How can this fail when Wx plus b is 0 for one of the perceptrons? Okay, so let's think about this for a bit. Uh, for any input x to any particular perceptron by the network, okay, so now you're replacing them by sigmoids, right? So when you replace them by sigmoids, essentially what you've done is just added the sigmoid layer on top of all the stuff which you had. So when you multiply them with a positive constant, it would only scale the values. So if you have say a value -1, it would scale it to say -10, or if you had a value of +1, it would scale it to a +10, right? And in the limit as c tends to infinity, say if you had a negative value or if you had a positive value, say if you had one and you scale it like crazy and you get a million, then after applying the sigmoid as we had discussed earlier, you would get a value which is tending to 1. So the prediction itself wanted to be a 1 because the value was greater than 0. And if the value was less than 0, you've essentially scaled it to say a negative million. So you've predicted a 0. So there isn't any difference actually. This is behaving exactly as perceptrons because it is now giving either a 0 or a 1. So how can this fail when you have zero, right? So when you have zero, scaling doesn't really make a difference, right? If you scale zero by a factor of even a trillion, it would still remain a zero. So you would always lie at this point. So this would not model a perceptron. A perceptron is being modeled when the value is either being a 1 or a 0. The difference between the perceptron and the sigmoid, as we discussed, is just that one layer, right? Apart from the inputs no longer being discrete 0 or 1, the major difference would be there being a new sigmoid layer, which is applying that particular activation function. So while in the case of the perceptron you would be getting a 0 or a 1, here you are getting these discrete values, but if you're multiplying them with highly large scalar quantities, you're essentially forcing it to the behavior of the perceptron, because you're forcing it to the extreme edges, and at those edges it behaves just like a perceptron. But in the case of the 0, it wouldn't go anywhere, so it would fail to behave as a perceptron. So this was a these are were really great questions. And if you didn't really get my rationale or think I'm making some mistake, then do comment down below. Okay. So let's just have a look at the architecture of neural networks as well. And I believe this would be the last section which we'll cover, and probably we'll cover the next section in the next video. So in the next section, I'll introduce a neural network that can do a pretty good job classifying handwritten digits. In preparation for that, it helps to explain some terminology that lets us name different parts of a network. Suppose we have the network, okay? So it has three inputs, one layer, then another layer, and then the output. As mentioned, the leftmost layer is the input. The neurons within the layer are called input neurons. The rightmost or the output layer is called the output neuron, or in this case, a single output neuron. So this is the output neuron. The middle layer is called the hidden layer, since the neuron are neither input nor output. The term hidden might sound a bit mysterious. The little the first time I heard the term, I thought it must have some deep philosophical or mathematical significance, but it really means nothing more than not an input or an output. The network above has just one hidden layer, which is this one, but some networks have multiple hidden layers. So, for instance, this one has two hidden layers, one input layer and one output layer. So, this is a four-layer network. Somewhat confusingly, and for historical reasons, multiple layer networks are sometimes called multi-layer perceptrons or MLPs, despite being made up of sigmoid neurons, not perceptrons. I am not going to use that MLP terminology in the book since I think it's confusing, but wanted to warn you of its existence. This is a really good thing about this book, because you're not always going to have this book as your reading material, right? You will be reading tons of different things, and you might get confused with some other terminology. So it's really great that the author has uh, put this extra effort to make this stuff clear. The design of the input and output in a network is often straightforward. Of course, you know the input and the output. For instance, if we're trying to determine whether a number is a 9 or a naught, a natural way is to design the network to encode the intensity of the image pixel into the inputs. So if you have a 64 by 64 image, then you have 4096 neurons. So each particular pixel corresponds to a particular neuron, and their intensity is being scaled between 0 and 1. The output layer will contain just a single neuron. So if the value in that neuron is greater than zero point 0.5, you have uh, an image which is a 9. If it is less than zero point 0.5, then it is not a 9. So you might be thinking, why not take like two nodes in, one for 9, one not for 9, one for not 9? You can do that as well. That is a very totally valid approach. So but this is in this case we are looking at binary outputs. While the design of the input and output layer of the neural network is often straightforward, there can be quite an art to design the hidden layers. In particular, it's not possible to sum up the design process with a simple rule. Okay. Instead, neural network researchers have developed many design heuristics for the hidden layers, which help people get the behavior they want out of their nets. For example, such heuristics can be used to determine how to trade off the network of hidden layers against the time required to train the network. We'll meet several such design heuristics later in the book. So you might reasonably guess, like if you have more deeper networks, it they would get into more problems. They would take longer time to train, more computational power to train as well. So up to now we've been discussing neural networks where the output from one layer is used as input to the next layer. Such networks are called feed-forward neural networks. So you're essentially feeding forward the data. This means there are no loops in the network. Information is always going ahead and never coming back. So being fed forward and never fed back. If we did have loops, we'd end up in a situation where the input of the sigmoid function depends on the output. That would be hard to make sense of, and so we don't allow such loops. However, there are other models of artificial neural networks in which feedback loops are possible. These models are called recurrent neural networks, which are something which we'll probably get into sometime later. The idea in these models is to have neurons which fire for some limited duration before becoming quiescent. I'm not really sure what that word means, but I can guess. But let's just have a look. Inactive or dormant. Yep. That firing can simulate other neurons which may fire little while later also for limited duration. That causes still more neurons to fire, and so over a time we get a cascade of neurons firing. Loops don't cause problems in such a model since the neuron's output only affects its input at some later time, not instantaneously. So if you didn't really get this part, it's not really. I say don't fret about it. Give it a read. Maybe try reading the basics of recurrent neural networks on Wikipedia or some blog page. There are some insanely good blog pages on towards data science. So you can try that, or don't really fret about it because I think we'll probably get into recurrent neural networks a bit later, and we haven't even had a look at our first program, right? So don't really jump ahead if you're not feeling too comfortable. But if you are, by all means. Recurrent neural networks have been less influential than feed-forward networks in part because the learning algorithms for recurrent nets are, at least to date, less powerful. But recurrent networks are still extremely interesting. They are much closer in spirit into how our brains work than feed-forward networks because they are loopings in the brain. But it's possible that recurrent networks can solve important problems which can only be solved with great difficulty by feed-forward networks. However, to limit our scope in this book, we are going to concentrate on the more widely used feed-forward network. So he's not going to cover it, but I'm probably going to do some reading for that one as well. So, to just give you an idea of what recurrent neural networks are, I'll just show you a image which would make it much more clear. Yeah. So, this is what recurrent neural networks look like. So, essentially, the next layer is affected by the output of the next output is affected by outputs of the previous output. So this is what the structure architecture of a recurrent neural network is, and where is it used? It is used extensively in word and sentence predictions. Other forms such as LSTMs, GRUs, transformers are also used a lot. It is used in predictions in time series and many other applications are there. So we'll be stopping here. You can I'd highly recommend reading yourself or going through the stuff yourself. But this is what it is. Thank you.